The prairie had its own way of keeping secrets. Some were buried under the dry earth. Some were locked behind lips that had forgotten how to speak. And then there was Clara Boone, a widow of 50 who came riding into a dusty frontier town with nothing more than a patched dress, her quiet-eyed son, and a promise to serve others until she could find a place to belong. She thought she was here to help. She didn't know she'd be tested, and she couldn't have guessed she'd leave with 3 more children calling her mama. It began with the smell of wood smoke and bread rising in the early morning. Clara worked in the kitchen of a boarding house, sleeves rolled hands steady. She was used to people glancing past her as if a widow past her prime had no stories worth hearing. But one evening, as shadows lengthened across the yard, she found them 3 small faces peering from behind the chicken coop. Ragged, hungry, eyes old before their time. Nobody in town claimed them. Nobody wanted them. That night she brought them a slice of bread, each tucking it into their hands as if passing contraband. She thought it would end there. It didn't. By the time the first frost came, whispers had started. Why is she keeping strays? Mark my words, trouble follows them. And trouble did. A man named Elias Crow, all sharp teeth and swagger, rode into town claiming those children as his by blood. The same man who had once abandoned them without a backward glance. The law wasn't clear. The sheriff didn't want to fight. And the town just watched. Here's the part folks never tell you in frontier stories. Sometimes the biggest battles are fought without bullets. Clara stood on the porch that day, the wind tugging at her shawl, Elias's shadow long across the dirt. "You can't take what I've made mine in love," she told him, voice quiet but unshakable. What happened after would change the shape of her life forever, and it would force her to decide whether blood law or love would be the final word. Because in the Wild West, you don't just find family. Sometimes you fight for it. And when the dust settled, the question lingered. Had Clara just saved those children, or had they saved her? Do you want to hear the rest of the story? The town of Dry Willow didn't greet strangers. It merely tolerated them the way an old hound tolerates a passing cart, watchful, unmoving, waiting to see if trouble rolls off the back. Dust hung in the late summer air, like a veil that would not lift. Every step down the main street stirred up the same tired smell, sun-baked wood horse sweat and the faint tang of the blacksmith's forge. Clara Boone kept her head straight, her eyes steady the way a woman must when she's learned life notices weakness. At 52, her hair had surrendered to silver in thin streaks, but her back was still straight, her grip still strong. In one hand, she carried a worn satchel with neat stitches where the leather had cracked. In the other, she held the smaller hand of her 17-year-old son, Daniel, whose long legs kept him just half a step behind. They had traveled for days, rattling in a wagon that wasn't theirs to reach this place. Clara had told herself over and over, "We are here to give, not to take." She was bringing Daniel to the mission house to work, fix fences, carry water patch roofs, anything that might help those who had less than even they did. The Dry Willow mission sat on the edge of town, half school, half shelter. Its paint had blistered under years of sun, but the front steps were swept, and someone had planted marigolds by the door. It was not beauty in the grand sense, but it was cared for, and that mattered. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of beans cooking over a slow fire. Beds lined one wall, thin mattresses, but clean. In the far corner, 3 children sat huddled together. They were not siblings yet. They shared the same posture, arms wrapped around their knees, eyes darting toward the door each time it creaked. A tall man appeared from behind a curtain, Reverend Paul Avery, the mission's keeper. His voice was calm, his eyes quick and assessing. "Mrs. Boone," he asked. "Yes," Clara said. "We've come to offer our help. No pay expected." Daniel stepped forward. "I can mend a fence or carry wood. Ma can cook." Paul nodded, a flicker of relief passing through his face. "Then you've come at the right time. We're short on hands and shorter on hope." He glanced toward the 3 children. "They've been here a week, no kin willing to claim them." Clara followed his gaze. The smallest girl, no more than 6, stared at Clara with open curiosity, like she was trying to decide if this new woman was safe. Clara's heart gave a strange protective pull, one she quickly pushed down. She had not come here to gather more burdens. Yet she crossed the room, knelt, and offered the girl a small piece of cornbread from her satchel. "Eat slow," she said gently. "Make it last." The child's small hand trembled as it took the bread. From behind her, Paul's voice came quiet, as if he already knew Mrs. Boone. They're going to need more than bread. Clara came to Dry Willow to give her son strength to the mission. But why does it already feel like the mission's children are reaching straight for her heart? And if she lets them in, what will it cost her? The first night in Dry Willow was not a quiet one. The mission walls were thin, and Clara lay awake listening to the wind rattle the shutters and the restless shifting of children in their beds. Daniel slept in the loft above the main room, his even breathing a comfort she could trace in the darkness. Down below, one of the older boys, maybe 10, let out a muffled sob, thinking no one could hear. Clara did not move. She learned long ago that rushing to comfort a wound you didn't understand could drive it deeper. Still, her mind wandered back to a winter decades ago when she herself had been left in a cold room after her husband's boots disappeared into the snow, never to return. She remembered holding Daniel, only a baby then, so close she could feel the rhythm of his tiny heartbeat under her palm. That was when she decided she would stand for herself with or without a man's name beside hers. At dawn, she was up before the others, stirring beans in a dented pot. The smell brought small footsteps padding across the wooden floor. The girl from yesterday, the one with the cornbread, stood in the doorway, hair a tangle, eyes watchful. "Morning," Clara said. The girl didn't answer, only shuffled closer, drawn by the steam. Clara ladled a portion into a tin bowl, set it on the table. "Sit," she said simply. Moments later, the other two children joined Ben, tall and bony, and May, with eyes the color of wet earth after rain. They ate without speaking, glancing at Clara now and then, as if measuring her. Daniel came down the ladder, rubbing his eyes. "We're fixing the chicken coop today, Ma," he said. Reverend Paul nodded from across the room. "And the fence after that. It's falling in 3 places." By mid-morning, the yard was alive with work. Daniel swung the hammer. Clara mended a tear in a curtain with careful stitches. The children followed her, at first watching, then fetching scraps of cloth and mimicking her motions. As the sun climbed, Clara saw the way May's hands shook when a stranger passed the gate, the way Ben flinched at sudden noises, the way the little girl pressed her back to the wall whenever the door swung open too quickly. It was in those moments Clara felt the old ache return, not the ache of loneliness, but the ache of recognition. She had been these children once, invisible to the world, unless trouble found her. That evening, while washing dishes, Reverend Paul said quietly, "They trust you faster than most." Clara shook her head. "They don't trust me. They trust the food, the quiet, the not being yelled at." Paul's eyes softened. That's where trust begins. Clara had come to serve strangers, but with every passing day, the mission's children seemed less like strangers and more like pieces of a life she thought she'd buried. If they reach for her, will she have the strength or the will to reach back? By the second week, Clara had learned the rhythms of the mission, the early prayers, the mid-morning repairs, the way the wind carried dust so fine it crept into every fold of fabric. But she'd also learned something else: these children had been broken in ways that didn't heal with warm food and clean clothes. Ben, though quiet, had a temper that flared like prairie fire. One afternoon, when Daniel accidentally bumped him with a load of kindling, Ben's fist was already mid-swing before Clara caught his wrist. She didn't scold, only held his gaze until his breathing slowed. His eyes didn't carry malice, they carried panic like a cornered animal. May spoke little, but when she did, her words were barbed with suspicion. Clara found her hiding biscuits in her pockets just in case. When Clara gently told her there would always be more food tomorrow, May only muttered, "That's what they all say." And the youngest, little Annie, refused to sleep unless the lamp burned all night. The one time it was blown out by the wind, Clara woke to find her trembling in a corner, eyes wide, whispering, "They can't find me in the dark." Clara tried to keep her heart steady, but the memories came of Daniel at age 5, clutching her skirt when men came to collect a debt his father had left unpaid. Of the long nights she'd stayed awake, afraid of every creak in the floorboards. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Reverend Paul asked her to help serve supper to a group of ranch hands passing through. She hesitated. Town men had a way of talking that made her feel small again, but agreed. The moment the men entered, the children froze. Ben's jaw clenched. May disappeared to the loft. Annie gripped Clara's apron and wouldn't let go. And then Clara saw it, one of the men, a lanky figure with a scar across his cheek, staring at Annie with a too familiar recognition. Clara's skin went cold. She didn't know the whole story yet, but her bones told her one truth: trouble had just stepped through the mission door. By the second week, Clara had learned the rhythms of the mission, the early prayers, the mid-morning repairs, the way the wind carried dust so fine it crept into every fold of fabric. But she'd also learned something else: these children had been broken in ways that didn't heal with warm food and clean clothes. Ben, though quiet, had a temper that flared like prairie fire. One afternoon, when Daniel accidentally bumped him with a load of kindling, Ben's fist was already mid-swing before Clara caught his wrist. She didn't scold, only held his gaze until his breathing slowed. His eyes didn't carry malice, they carried panic like a cornered animal. May spoke little, but when she did, her words were barbed with suspicion. Clara found her hiding biscuits in her pockets just in case. When Clara gently told her there would always be more food tomorrow, May only muttered, "That's what they all say." And the youngest little Annie refused to sleep unless the lamp burned all night. The one time it was blown out by the wind, Clara woke to find her trembling in a corner, eyes wide, whispering, "They can't find me in the dark." Clara tried to keep her heart steady, but the memories came of Daniel at age 5, clutching her skirt when men came to collect a debt his father had left unpaid, of the long nights she'd stayed awake, afraid of every creak in the floorboards. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Reverend Paul asked her to help serve supper to a group of ranch hands passing through. She hesitated. Town men had a way of talking that made her feel small again, but agreed. The moment the men entered, the children froze. Ben's jaw clenched. May disappeared to the loft. Annie gripped Clara's apron and wouldn't let go. And then Clara saw it, one of the men, a lanky figure with a scar across his cheek, staring at Annie with a too familiar recognition. Clara's skin went cold. She didn't know the whole story yet, but her bones told her one truth: trouble had just stepped through the mission door. The widow had come to Dry Willow to help strangers, not to defend against old dangers. But now, with one man's stare, the past she thought she'd left behind was circling back, only this time it wasn't after her alone. The man with the scar, his name she would later learn, was Elias Crow, didn't cause a scene that night. He ate in silence, though his eyes flicked toward Annie more times than Clara could count. After supper, Reverend Paul thanked the men for their work repairing the east fence. Most drifted toward the door. Ilias lingered. He passed within a foot of Clara, and in a voice meant only for her murmured, "That little one's got her mama's eyes." Clara's breath caught, but she forced herself not to react. Annie had never spoken of her parents, but Clara had pieced enough together to know they weren't the sort a child should be returned to. When Elias finally left, Clara found Annie curled under her cot, refusing to come out. May sat cross-legged nearby, arms crossed. "He's no good," May muttered. "We knew men like him." Over the next few days, the air in Dry Willow seemed heavier. Elias was seen in town asking questions. Folks said he was looking for lost family. Clara noticed Reverend Paul watching her more closely, his voice careful when asking if everything was all right. But the children noticed too. Ben grew restless, pacing the yard like a watchdog. May kept her stash of biscuits close. Annie clung to Clara's hand wherever they went. And Daniel, dear Daniel, finally asked the question she'd been trying to avoid. "Mama, if someone tried to take one of them away, would you fight for them the way you fought for me?" Clara stopped in her tracks. The answer was obvious, but speaking it aloud made her heart beat harder. "Yes," she said softly, "I would." That night, as the wind rattled the shutters, Clara sat by the small fire in the mission's kitchen. She could feel it in her bones: Elias Crow wasn't finished, and the walls of this safe haven weren't as thick as she'd hoped. Trouble was no longer a shadow on the horizon. It had a name, a face, and a reason to pry open the mission's doors. And Clara knew that when Elias came again, it wouldn't be with words. The storm rolled in just after sunset, thick clouds swallowing the moonlight. Clara had just finished tucking Annie in when she heard the crunch of boots on gravel. Too steady to be the wind, too close to be ignored. She stepped into the hall and found Reverend Paul at the door, speaking in a low voice to a silhouette in the rain. Elias Crow. His hat dripped water, but his eyes burned with something colder than the storm. "I'm here for my kin," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "You've no papers." "No proof," Reverend Paul replied, holding the door half closed. "Proof," Elias's lips twisted. "I've got blood, and blood calls louder than any paper." Clara's hands clenched at her sides. She stepped forward before she knew she was moving. You'll not take her. Elias's gaze shifted to her slow as a rattler sizing up prey. You must be the one they whisper about, the widow with a bleeding heart. You think you can keep what's mine? She's not yours, Clara said, her voice low but steady. The tension stretched brittle as dry timber. Then Elias smiled an ugly knowing thing and stepped back into the rain. We'll see about that. All through the night, Clara sat in the mission's small kitchen with a lantern burning every creak in the floorboards, sounding like a threat. She could hear the storm battering the walls, but it was the silence between the gusts that chilled her. When dawn finally came, she found a dead crow nailed to the front gate. A warning. Elias had left without a fight, but the message was clear: he wasn't gone, and next time he wouldn't come alone. By mid-morning, the storm had passed, but its shadow lingered. Clara knew something had shifted. Elias wasn't bluffing. He would come back, and this time the law might not be enough to keep him away. She spent the day in quiet motion, mending torn curtains, stacking wood higher by the stove, pressing warm biscuits into the children's hands. Every small act felt like laying bricks in a wall she meant to stand behind. That afternoon, Reverend Paul found her in the yard, her skirts damp from hanging laundry in the cold. You're running yourself ragged, he said. I've run farther for less, she replied, pinning a sheet. I won't let him decide who these children belong to. Reverend Paul hesitated. You can't fight every battle alone. Clara's eyes met his, steady. I've been alone most of my life. That's why I know I can. But she wasn't entirely alone. That evening, Thomas Hale, the quiet rancher who'd been delivering milk since the first frost, stopped by unannounced. His hat in his hands, his boots muddy. He looked almost embarrassed. Word is Crow's been sniffing around, he said. If you need someone to stand at your gate, I'll be there. Clara felt the words settle somewhere deep warm, in a place she hadn't touched in years. Why, she asked softly. Because you've been standing for them, Thomas said, nodding toward the children's laughter drifting from inside. Seems right someone stands for you. That night, Clara locked the door, not out of fear, but to mark a line. This was her home now, and no one would cross it without her say. The fence had been drawn, but the question remained: when Elias came back, would she be ready to face him, and what it might cost? The next Sunday broke crisp and still, the kind of morning where sound carried far. Clara had just set the bread to rise when she saw him, Elias Crow, riding slow up the road, two men flanking him like shadows. She stepped onto the porch before they could dismount, her shawl tight, her voice steady. You've got no business here, Elias. He dismounted with a grin that never reached his eyes. I've got 3, and they're mine to claim. The children were inside, but Clara felt their small faces behind the curtain. She took one step forward. They are not yours. You left them in the cold, and I took them in. That's all the law I need. Elias smirked. Law don't work that way. From the side gate, Thomas Hale appeared, rifle slung, but not raised. She said no, Crow. You ought to hear her. Elias' smirk faltered at the sight of Thomas. For a moment, no one moved, just the wind pressing the grass flat. Then Clara spoke again, her voice firm enough to pin the moment in place. They call me Mama now. That isn't something you can take. You can threaten, you can lie, but you can't undo love once it's rooted. Something in her tone, calm, sure, made Elias step back. He swung into the saddle, muttering curses, and was gone with his men trailing. Inside, the children rushed to her arms, wrapping her waist. Her own son, Jacob, whispered, You didn't even shake, Mama. She smiled, smoothing his hair. I've been shaking my whole life, son. I just learned how to stand still through it. That night, Thomas stayed for supper. They didn't speak of what happened. They didn't need to. Outside, winter was coming, but inside, the house was warm. The danger had passed for now. But as Clara glanced at Thomas across the table, one thought kept her heart beating steady. Sometimes the family you fight for is the one you're still finding. In the end, Clara didn't ride away as the woman who came to serve others. She rode away as the woman who had found and fought for her own family. Her little boy no longer walked beside her alone. 3 more pairs of footsteps followed in the dust, each belonging to a child who finally knew the sound of a voice calling them home for supper. Life on the frontier would never be easy. There would still be long winters, hard work, and nights when the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. But now there would also be laughter under the roof, bread shared at the table, and a mother's hand for every small hand that reached for it. Maybe that's what the West teaches best, that family isn't just who you're born to, but who you choose, and who chooses you back. So perhaps this story isn't just about Clara. Maybe it's about you too, about the people you've stood beside when no one else would, about the way love can grow in the most unlikely soil. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to None Wild West Saga, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and leave a comment below. Would you like to hear more stories like Clara's? Or perhaps the next chapter in her journey, because out here there's always another tale worth telling.